Good afternoon. I would like to thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Yvonne Harris. I am one of the practice advisors with the Saskatchewan Registered Nurses Association. I am talking with you from my home office, aka my kitchen table. I again wish to thank you for joining us on today's webinar. This is the first of a three-part series on mentoring and mentorship with our guest host today, the esteemed Doug Lawrence. Before we get started, I do want to share a brief overview of the technical part of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to the SRNA website. If you do have questions, we ask that you submit them via the chat box, and then we will be able to look at those questions and share them with Doug. Doug is going to try and take some time at the end of today's webinar, 10 to 15 minutes, to answer them. But because he does have a tremendous amount of valuable information to share with us, if we don't have time to answer the questions today, as I say, this is part of a three-part series, so we would be able to answer the questions during part 2 or part 3 of the webinars. And again, the webinars will be posted to the SRNA website for future viewing. And I think that's all there is. If you do have any questions or any challenges with the technical components of this, we also have Tony Garuzzi with us here today, and he can, if you send a concern into the chat box, he will be able to look at some of the questions and help you with those. All right, so Doug, who is our guest speaker today, welcome Doug, thank you. Doug Lawrence is the founder of Talent C and co-founder of the International Mentor Community. He leads organizations to experience the benefits of how mentoring can encourage workforce culture to flow in harmony with mentors, improve productivity from employees or mentees, reducing costly employee onboarding, and improving the bottom line for organizations. He has been instrumental in developing a curriculum to help mentoring to become more effective, help people become more effective mentors. He is an international certified mentor practitioner, an international certified mentor facilitator, and has obtained his Certificate of Achievement in Mentoring and his Certificate of Competence as a mentor from the International Mentoring Community. Congratulations, Doug. That is phenomenal. His practice of mentoring has resulted in his accumulation of over 1,950 hours of mentoring in person and virtual, 197 hours of speaking opportunities, as well as 672 hours teaching others how to effectively mentor. He is a volunteer mentor with the Sir Richard Branson Entrepreneur Program in the Caribbean and with the American Corporate Partners in the United States, working with military personnel in their transition from military to civilian life. He is currently working with researchers to examine the role of mentoring as a support for those struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. His experience in law enforcement, coupled with working with people suffering from PTSD, has afforded him a unique view of mentoring and PTSD. He is an international speaker and author all about facets of mentoring. He published The Gift of Mentoring in 2014 with his second book set to publish this year, 2020. He works with organizations to establish mentoring programs, influence mentoring as a culture, and he provides one-on-one direct mentoring for individuals of all backgrounds and levels globally. He does have a website, and we will make sure that we post links to his different websites on our social media sites and our SRNA site. So welcome, Doug, and I turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you so much. And I'm coming to you live today from my dining room table.
Okay.
So I'll just get this going. Here we are. So hello, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us today for part 1 of a 3-part series on mentoring. And like Yvonne had mentioned, we'll have time at the end of today's session, hopefully. I'll make a commitment to do that, to be able to respond to some questions that you may very well have. So we'll get started here and get going. So I thought right off the bat, we should probably establish or try to get a common ground that we're all understanding where we're going. So I came up with some questions. What is mentoring? What is the role of the mentor? What is not the role? What is the role of the mentee? And then why mentoring? I'm going to kind of reverse the order, and I'm going to start with why mentoring. And I tie that specifically to a number of business challenges, and I'll speak about that more, but I'm a storyteller. So what it did was, when I was going through this, it sparked a story. And actually, yesterday, I was on a call with a chap from Dublin, Ireland. We were talking about mentoring, and he was telling me about his experience implementing mentoring programs in large corporations and stuff like that, and how after a year's time, the mentoring program kind of just fizzled out and didn't go anywhere. And so we had a bit of a conversation, and I got him to focus on the aspect of why mentoring. And what I basically asked him was, what's the business problem you're trying to solve by implementing mentoring? And if I can get him to think in that regard, say, for example, the best way for me to give you an example is high turnover rates in an organization. So if through mentoring you target reducing that high turnover rate by providing a culture that focuses on mentoring, you provide all the opportunities, all the benefits that you can get from mentoring relationships, and that will help drive down your high turnover rate. And so he went, I got to think about that a little bit more. And that's something that we need to maybe look at implementing here in Dublin. And so that just gives you a bit of an idea of, when you're going to be moving forward with a mentoring program initiative, workplace mentoring, always ask yourself the question, why are we doing this? What's the business problem that we're trying to solve? So then from there, I have a little trick question for you right out of the gate. So the role of the mentor, here's my questions for you. There are 6 descriptors of the role of the mentor, 2 of which are probably not the best answer that you could pick. So I'll just give you a couple seconds just to think about, is it number 1? Is it number 2? Is it number 3, 4, 5, or 6? And so typically what we can do is want to pop it into the chat feature, and what your answer is just by number, and we can take a quick look at that. So Yvonne, if you can see, can you just mention what numbers are popping up there for us?
I see, the numbers that I see coming up are 1, 2, and 6
Okay.
is one person's. And I think people are still reviewing them here. I'll put.
So what we can do in the interest of time is we'll be kind and gentle on a Tuesday, and we'll guide them to the answers like a good mentor should.
Okay.
So number 3 is definitely not the role of a mentor. It does happen, but it's definitely not the role. And number 5 is definitely not the role of the mentor. The conversation between a mentee and a mentor, and we'll use those 2 terms quite often for the rest of our conversation today, but the information that so when I meet with a mentee, one of the very first things that I specify is that our conversation is confidential, and what takes place between us stays between us. And so I don't share any information about my mentee unless I have their permission to do so. So if their supervisor comes to me and says, I understand you're meeting with Sally, and would you tell me what came out of that? I absolutely refuse to do so. And so that's something that's very important. It's almost, if you wanted to look at mentoring and add the ethic piece to it, what is considered to be ethical, not sharing information about your mentee is the right answer. So from an ethics perspective, all your conversations need to be confidential, and you would only share if given permission to do so. And even if the supervisor asks for some information, excuse me, on how the sessions are going, I very seldom, I don't offer anything on that regard whatsoever. So then here is a little bit better example of the role of the mentor, the role model, guidance, encouragement, developing a relationship. And I'm going to add one word. So when we talk about building a mentoring relationship, we talk about building a trusted relationship. So it's premised on the idea of trust. And so that's really important. Support is another role, creating a comfortable learning environment. And I have another story to share just about how important creating that safe place for a conversation to take place. I was working with a young lady who was sort of on the ropes for quite possibly being terminated because she was viewed as a non-performer. So anyhow, we spent a number of times together in a mentoring conversation, and one of the things that I was always amazed was we would have an hour session, and I would talk for 45 to 50 minutes. I would fill all the airtime with conversations, and I thought, gosh, there's got to be something wrong here because I'm the one doing all the talking, and this individual, this young person, isn't contributing anything at all. So I asked at the end of the conversation, what was the value that we got from our conversation today? And in particular, I'm interested to learn what you got from our conversation. And her response was that she felt safe in my presence, that I had created a comfortable learning environment, and it was one that she felt safe in being able to do so. And the learning part, as I mentioned earlier, storyteller, she was able to see herself in the stories that I told. And as a result of that, she felt more comfortable, and her self-esteem had increased immensely, so that when she walked out of the room at the end of our conversation, she was full of confidence, was going out there to tackle whatever her supervisor threw at her for work and stuff like that. And she felt comfortable and safe in doing so. So that is probably one of the main things for you to keep kind of tucked in the back of your mind as a role of a mentor. Then, of course, we get into challenging the mentee to explore various. So that's the career development piece. And I'm going to talk a little bit with you here in a few slides about the two different paths that you can take a mentoring relationship, and one of which is in most cases is overlooked. And so we'll talk about that here in just a couple minutes. You need to be accessible, respond in a timely manner. That's all about establishing the expectations, establishing clear boundaries, and like we talked about earlier, maintaining confidentiality. So where did this whole thing about mentoring come to be, and how long has it been around? Well, it goes back about 3,000 years. It's just a little older than what I am. So it does go back quite a period of time, and it deals with back around the time frame of, and it deals a lot with the story of Mentor in Homer's Odyssey, and from there it's evolved. There's been a historical link to the Middle Ages and the traditional style of the gray-haired old sage on top of the mountain passing on their wisdom and knowledge, and that's all changed. That's evolved, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Excuse me. And then in 1970, it was actually started to see as a way to develop corporate executives. And I know a lot of my mentoring practice involves working with people at the vice president and president level to help them develop the skills that they need to have to be successful as leaders in our, in our organizations today. And then from the 1970s onwards, mentoring's is on the increase. It's continuously increasing its use in the workplace. It's now, mentorship is a relationship that can span all kinds of geographies, all kinds of sectors, genders, generations. I actually had another story. Here I go again. I just had this past summer, I think it was, or the summer before, I worked with a group of master's students who was going through industrial psychology to get their master's degree. And I actually worked with them to do some research for me on genders, not so much on generations, but definitely on genders and mentoring. And it was quite interesting, some of the research material that they brought out. They brought out stuff that talked about the 21st century, the language of mentoring and the language of gender. And it was actually quite interesting to sort of see what they were able to find. Mentoring is not about a particular outcome or destination. It's actually a journey. And a lot of times you'll hear me talk about going on a mentoring journey with a mentee and stuff like that. And we've actually created a certification for a journey mentor. So somebody that is going to go through the process and become certified as a journey mentor. Excuse me. And it's a process of discovery, not just ladder climbing. So it's really important that we kind of wrap our heads around that part and we understand, how far back the history goes. Fast forward to today, and we're going through a paradigm shift. And so where I come from there is we talk about the traditional style of mentoring where it's the gray-haired old sage on top of the mountain passing on their wisdom and knowledge through telling, but not asking questions. Fast forward to today, and the effective mentor is a person who, through a trusted relationship, guides, supports, counsels a person through the world of work with a focus on, and here it comes, personal and professional growth and the facilitation of critical thinking skills. So the big thing here is, excuse me, is that professional growth is typically what you see in most corporate mentorship programs, and they shy away from the personal growth aspect. What I found with my research and in my mentoring practice is that if I don't address the personal growth first, then what ends up happening is the personal growth becomes an obstacle or barrier if it's not addressed to being able to move forward with professional growth. So I like to when I'm meeting with my mentee and that, I like to have conversations. Tell me a little bit about yourself. I'm getting a sense or a feeling that you have self-esteem issues or a lack of self-confidence. And then we'll talk about ways that we can work through that and be able to deal with that. And it's also the aspect of the facilitation of critical thinking skills. So part of the mentoring process is such that the intent, excuse me, the intent behind it is to be able to help your mentee to be able to stand on their own 2 feet and to be able to think their way through things. So part of your job as the mentor is to guide them through that process and help them sharpen those critical thinking skills that are there. And then the other part is a mentor is focused on trusted relationships and obviously, helping people prepare for current and future challenges. And those challenges can be both personal challenges as well as professional. So don't lose sight of the aspect of mentorship is just about career development. It goes way beyond that. And it's something that we tend, I know in a lot of corporate programs, we lose sight of the personal side. And so we need to make sure that we stay focused on that and make sure that that is included in there. Now, some of the challenges you'll run into is that when you're dealing with the personal side, that scares a lot of people and they're somewhat reluctant to want to go down that path. It's, excuse me, it's the same thing as wanting to build a trusted relationship. Building trust in a relationship sometimes requires that you have to share something personal about you, and you need to be able to feel comfortable enough to be able to do that. So, and it can be ideally something that's relevant, but sometimes it may not be. It may be just something that you're comfortable sharing that is personal in nature. And what that's going to do is help you build that relationship, that trusted relationship with the person you're spending time with. So here, excuse me, here's a list of some challenges that organizations are facing today. And these are all challenges that mentoring can be seen and actually is a solution to these business challenges. So you look at talent shortages, aging workforce, a lot of the Gen Ys and now soon to be Gen Zs, a lot of what they're looking for is they're looking for organizations that actually have mentoring programs, established mentoring programs within the organization. And that's what will help determine whether they want to come and work in that organization or not. We talk quite often to organizations about succession planning and succession development. And it's a great place to plug mentoring into. Leadership talent shortage. There is a global leadership talent shortage. Organizations around the world today are facing, they just don't have enough leadership talent. Part of that is a lack of succession planning and development. The other part is that we don't invest enough money in our current and future leaders to give them the tool sets, the skill sets that they need in order to be successful leaders within the company. Something to think about. The mobile workforce, typically that's my sensitive topic, one of many that I always talk about, which is mobile workforce typically refers to Gen Y, and the Generation Y it's been cited in different research documents that they will change jobs anywhere from 6 to 20 times over the course of their career. And what we're starting to see now that's taking place is that same philosophy is now spreading itself to some of the other generations as well. From a culture perspective, what they're basically saying is, if the culture doesn't fit me, then I'm going to go look elsewhere. And so hence the term mobile workforce. And then last but sort of not least is the whole concept of the disengaged employee. And disengagement is still an issue globally. You can do a Google search on disengagement or disengaged employees, and the numbers are startling. And it's something to think about. And mentoring, it's all tied back to a culture where mentoring is the predominant factor. And when you do that, you also then create a way to be able to deal with the disengaged employee. And so another thing for us to think about down the road. I get asked a lot of questions about this next one, coaching and mentoring. And I'm not going to spend too much time going through this. Suffice it to say that we all agree to disagree on our definition of coaching and mentoring, but this has got some good points in it. From my perspective, mentoring is a longer term relationship. It's one that has definitely got quite a bit of focus on the personal side, so focusing on the employee or the individual. They drive the conversation. So I just finished a session this morning. I think we started talking at 7. So I'm working with the American corporate partners, and I was talking with my mentee in Florida, and he drove the conversation. It was his agenda, and I followed along with him and just provided encouragement, support, and guidance. And that was what he wanted. He wanted to be able to to drive where we were going to go in that. So take some time. This is going to be popped up on your website. So take some time to go through and take a look at it. And if you have some questions, let's get those captured, and we can talk about those either at the beginning of part 2 or at the end when we're going to have a bit of a fireside chat, so to speak, and talk about mentoring in general. So we'll do that then. So one of the things, and we kind of talked about or started to talk about this, was the benefits of mentoring. And so I want you to think for just a moment, from a personal perspective, what would be some of the benefits that we would get from being involved in a mentoring relationship? So some of those are most definitely when I work with people, I'm very much focused on the self-care part of it, is how are they feeling and all of that sort of stuff. And I spend quite a bit of time asking questions around, or getting my intuition kicks in a lot of times, but it's excuse me, it's understanding self-esteem, self-confidence, self-worth, kind of the selves. The 3 main selves is how I refer to them. But it's really important that we as individuals and we as mentors, that we help our mentees understand that there are benefits of mentoring on a personal level, and there's also on a professional level. And even on the personal side, like some of the things that we will be talking about over the next 3 sessions, is we talk about effective communication. That has a huge spin-off for you when you take a look at how I communicate within my family, how I communicate within my community with others, and how do I communicate within the organization as well. So it's a blend of both personal and professional, but certainly from the aspect of, how do I communicate effectively with my significant other, or with my children or grandchildren, or any of those. There are things that we can learn from the mentoring process that we can apply to each one of those different areas. And then on a professional basis, it's much the same. When I take a look at what is the ideal leader that I would want to work with in an organization, and it's somebody that's gone and done some effective mentoring, who has taken and observed the different things that you need to be aware of when you communicate effectively. It's somebody that knows how to deal with a crucial conversation, and how to know when to back out of the conversation and wait till it's safe to re-enter. So it's all of those things. So the benefits are there. We sometimes get caught up in our own world and don't think outside the box of how mentoring can actually play such a huge, huge role in our personal and professional lives. Now, there's two key areas, and I've already touched on one. The first is the trusted relationship. Now, that's really important because if you can't build a trusted relationship within a reasonable period of time, then what's going to end up happening is your mentoring relationship as it stands is going to dissolve. So focus on building trust. Do the self-care, make sure that you believe in yourself, and don't be afraid to share something personal in order to start building that trusted relationship. When I get brought into organizations to, I have a service I call mentoring versus termination. So I get brought in when they're looking at terminating an employee, and what I end up having to do in a very compressed period of time, because I typically only allow myself 5 hours to turn the relationship around and get the employee back on track again. But I have to be able to build trust within 1 or 2 sessions with that employee. So it's very important to be comfortable in sharing something about yourself in order to be able to do that. Now, we talk about effective communication in a lot of different ways. I come at it from, and we'll spend some time on that a little later on, but I come at it from the aspect of crucial conversations, trigger words in a conversation, deflections. My pausing technique is another one that I talk about, is when you're in a rather deep discussion or a heated discussion, and you just want to fire back these comments, these one-liners. What I encourage you to do is pause and think for a minute. How is what I'm about to say going to be received by the other person? And if at any time it feels as though it's not going to be received well, then you need to stop, rethink what you're thinking of saying, maybe reword it, and then go through that process again. What you'll also find by doing that pausing technique is you become a lot more adept at thinking on your feet, and you're able to then be in high pressure conversations where things are just coming to you one right after the other. And it's all because of using that technique, that it helps you become comfortable, but it also helps you think a lot on your feet as well. We'll go through some of these a little bit later on in here. But this one you'll sort of see, sound like a broken record, but it's the foundation to successful mentoring. And we've talked about how to build it. You need to be whole as a person. That's so important, is I, as your mentor, need to be whole as a person. No baggage, no bias, none of that stuff. And we need to set expectations and boundaries. So both the mentor and the mentee, how I sometimes describe that is what's in and what's out. So what are the things that we're comfortable talking about, and what are the things that we don't want to talk about? And then understanding that if that does happen, we need to be able to have something figured out when we have our conversation about expectations. How are we going to deal with that when a conversation starts to head in a direction that we originally had said, let's not talk about that sort of stuff. So feeling comfortable at being able to have those conversations. Hence the whole idea of creating a safe place. What I'm finding is more and more often is that what we need to be able to do as mentors, and it's so important, is to be able to create that safe place for the conversation to take place. That can be in a coffee shop if both of you feel comfortable that way. That can be in an office setting behind closed doors where no one else can hear your conversation. It can be, let's go for a walk and just talk. Or it can be a virtual. Nowadays, virtual seems to be the way that a lot of things are going. I'm doing a lot of the work that I do virtually. And so we figure out a way that we can have that conversation and make sure that it's done in a safe and productive manner. So this is a picture of, not my house. So I created this analogy of a house as part of the relationship building process. So keep that whole, that beautiful structure in mind. And now we're going to talk about the trusting phase. So when it comes to building a relationship, there's all kinds of research and literature out there on mentoring phases are 7 or 8 different phases. And what I did was I chunked it all down to 3. And I felt that this was the best approach to be able to keep it simple. And so the first phase is, like we've been already talking about, is the trusting phase. This is a place where we may have to share something personal. This is where I like to do lots of self-reflection. So I reflect before I meet with my mentee, and I reflect after the session that I've had with my mentee. And I ask 3 questions. What went well? What didn't go well? And what will we do differently next time when we meet together? And I encourage you that if you haven't been doing reflection, that it's a great tool or technique to start to do on an ongoing basis. And the other part of it is to make sure you ask for feedback from your mentee. You'll probably remember the example that I gave where I said, what was the value that you got from our time together today? And ask that question and be open to receive the feedback that you're going to get, because it's really important that you understand, am I actually bringing value? Especially, am I bringing value? The time that we're spending together, is it worthwhile for both of us? So make sure that you ask for that. The learning and development phase, so now we start to see the walls going up on the house that we looked at earlier on. This is what I call the heavy lifting of the mentoring relationship. This is where you're going to deal with whatever things the mentee wants to talk about. This is where you're going to storytell, and you're going to be able to share some of your experiences through storytelling. So it's really important. The trusting phase, the one earlier, you could potentially develop a level of trust in 2 or 3 conversations. Sometimes it goes longer. And I've had situations where I was not able to build trust, and we ended up having to terminate the mentoring relationship and look for someone else for that person to work with. So that's just something to be aware of. Learning and development can go on for as long as you want it to go on. It just depends. And the next phase is the maintenance phase, and you can float back and forth. So you can go back and forth between the learning and development phase and the maintenance phase. And with the maintenance phase, how I describe that is typically you're not actively meeting on a regular basis. It's kind of somewhat, you'll be meeting maybe once every month, then it becomes once every 6 months, then it becomes maybe once a year, or it could be you bump into each other in the grocery store. How's it going? Great. Okay. Hopefully I'll see you here in another year, so to speak. So the idea behind it is that with the maintenance phase, that what it is that there's not enough activity there for us to keep the relationship going in a sort of full-time aspect. So we go to I like to keep it at a month for a little bit of time, just because I don't want something to happen where all of a sudden there's been a change in employment, or there's been something tragic happen within the family that they need somebody to talk to. I don't want to lose that. So I typically try to do it on a monthly basis, and then we can evolve after that. So And that's kind of the maintenance. And you can, like I said, you can go from maintenance back to learning and development to the L&D phase if you wish. Um, it's whatever seems to work the best for you. So we talked a little bit earlier about Gen Y. Oops, got excited there for a moment. There we go. Journey through generations. So I did this presentation. I did a one-day workshop in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and I had some help from a couple people that were right into this whole generation thing. And what we did was we created this journey through the generations. Ooh, the word journey, there it comes. So there we go. We go through all the different generations right down to the most current one, which is I prefer Gen Z, but they call them iGen, Gen Z. And there's some interesting statistics or information around this. So what I'm going to do is kind of quickly walk us through this. So the traditionalists are and you'll find that when you do your own research on generations, that you'll get, depending on where you go for information, you'll get different categories or age groups will be used. So this is one that we pulled together from that presentation. So typically traditionalists are, 1925 to 1945. There are loyal, hardworking, respect authority. They have traditional morals, all of those things. All of this material will be posted on the website, and please take the time to go through, because I'm giving you the whirlwind tour through the generations here. So baby boomers, excuse me, born 1946 to 64, lead me to information, the traditional classroom instruction. They look for opportunities to learn and grow professionally. And if given the opportunity to become an instructor or a mentor, they would transfer their knowledge and skills quite willingly, to say the least. Then we get to the Gen X, 1965 to 79. This is now where technology starts to play a huge part in the generations, where they are willing to adopt technology-based learning formats. They constantly want to be adding to their skill set, and a lot of that is technology-wise. They expect to be connected to instant messaging, to be able to quickly access and download highly focused training using technology and that. So I'll come back to that. It was another story. Gen Y, the millennials, 1980 to 94. These poor folks, they get such a bad rap because we always talk about Gen Ys being a sense of entitlement and all of those things. And actually, they're not. It maybe appear that that's the way they are, but they actually are not. I've had millennials working with me that I'd trade all kinds of some of the other generations just to get my hands on some good millennials. And so they know they need to learn and adapt continuously. They embrace technology. They're most comfortable in a learner-centered environment. And learning needs to be hands-on, interactive, and fun. So this is where we talk about gamification and how things have to be done in an online game sort of context in order for it to be of interest. They respond well to engaging competitive nature of games and simulations. So artificial intelligence, augmented and virtual reality are all things that they're right into, and they want to be. The big thing out of this is Gen Y wants to be mentored, not managed or coached. And there was actually quite a bit of, where did I find it? It was a MSNBC, I think it was, said that 85 or 86% of the Gen Ys that they interviewed had said they want to be mentored, not managed or coached. So that's something for us as organizations to think about as we continue to move forward. And then we get to the most current one, the iGen, Gen Z, the digital natives. They're more tolerant of others, more cautious, less drinking and drugs in high schools. Yes, that's a good thing. More likely to think for themselves and not believe authority figures. So kind of that critical thinking outside the box. and they typically will delay having serious romantic relationships. And then less in-person and face-to-face contact, so more of the virtual stuff. So more time connecting, FaceTiming and all that using smartphones. They, like I said, they're right into this whole gamification, the gaming part, using AI, virtual, all that stuff. They grew up more supervised, more protected than prior generations. And they're the ones that hide under the covers at night to use their smartphone and do their social media stuff. And they're possibly more depressed than prior generations, which is interesting. And that comment about being more depressed than prior generations will fit quite nicely for us to have a conversation about in part 3 that we talk about. And hopefully you can see at the bottom, there's a link to some information on the generations and that you can tap into. And more depressed than prior, we talked about that, feels more lonely and not needed, and quite possibly a higher suicide rate. So those are all things for us to think about. And like I said, some of this will come back to as we get, I think part 3, I'm going to spend a bit more time around post-traumatic stress, mental health, and mental well-being. And then as my gift, so to speak, is here's a chart that I've been using for a while. We haven't built in the Gen I or Gen Z into it yet, but this just gives you an idea of values, expectations, behaviors, and goals. And something for you to most definitely think about. And so I am going to touch on one more thing, and then we're going to take some questions. So I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about my old buddy Socrates. And Socrates is just a tad older than I am. Lived in Athens around 470 BC. So the Socratic method is one of the most powerful tools that we use in mentoring today. And it's all about asking a series of questions, and rather than telling people what to do. So it, like the slide says, focuses on giving questions or asking questions and not giving answers. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's a method that is used in law schools, psychotherapy, human resource training, development. And if you think you've found yourself a great leader, be mindful of if they use this technique where they ask a series of questions to guide us to the answer. And great leaders, great mentors, great leaders use this technique a lot. And so it's something that's really, really beneficial. So let me give you some examples. So here is 5 different statements. And of the 5 statements, I believe there's 2 that are not good examples. So let's go through them. I don't have time to discuss this with you, and you should know what to do anyhow, so just do it. Probably not a good example of the Socratic method. You seem to be struggling with this challenge. Is there a different way that we could approach this? So I want you to look at the word we, because as soon as you, with the Socratic method, you always want to frame things in the context of we and us. So one of my favorite taglines that I use with people is, I will never leave you on the island by yourself. And so by shaping things in the context of we and us, it becomes a more of a collaborative journey, and it helps people, they feel less threatened and intimidated by, you need to do this or you need to do that. And instead, it's a matter of asking a series of questions. Yes, you will find where when you follow this process and you do it, where people will say, for Pete's sakes, just tell me the answer and quit asking me questions. Then what you can do is, what would happen if we were to do A, B, C, or D? So now I've given them options, I've given them answers, but I've still framed it in the context of a question. So just think your way through that. What would happen if we were to do A, B, C, or D? So now it's gone away from what the original question was. Now it's focused on, some answers, but it's also framed them in the context of a question. So it's a great technique. The next one, I'm hearing something in your voice that tells me you don't believe in yourself as much as I believe in you. Can you help me understand why that is? I actually had, I'll come back to that. I got to save all my stories for a little later. But remind me that I have to tell you the story of the young lady who had low self-esteem, and we'll come back to that part 2. So that one was a good one. If I were you, I would tell your boss that he's wrong. That is what I did when I was younger. And I'm willing to bet you weren't very successful. So that's definitely not one that you want to entertain. If I were you, I would tell your boss he's wrong. That is what I did when I was younger. No, wrong answer. And then finally, what would happen if we were to do X, which ties back into sort of the example that I gave. So what would happen if we were to do X? Once again, focus on the we and asking it in the context of a question. So I see we're probably about 8 minutes left. And so I'm going to suggest that we break there and we open it up to questions.
Okay, so there is one question from one of the attendees. Registered nurses are expected through practice standards, competencies, and code of ethics to mentor others as part of professional practice. RNs are also very busy in their daily work. What is one action individual RNs can take in their workplaces to mentor another team member? The next part of this question, or there's a next, what is an action RNs can take to be open to receiving mentoring as part of their professional practice? Are there resources RNs could access to support their mentoring journey? And the fourth part of this question, is there a more informal approach to mentoring that can be engaged by RNs? So I can repeat those questions if you want.
Let's start with the informal part first.
Okay.
So you can have a mentoring, workplace mentoring program where mentees and mentors are assigned to each other. But you can also, if you allow the culture to evolve where mentoring becomes a way of life, you can then have informal mentoring will then just happen because it can. So I always encourage organizations to think of it from the aspect of, let's have a combination of formal and informal mentoring, because you will attach yourself to people that you relate to, and it's from those type of individuals that you will actually, the informal mentoring will kick in. So can you give me one of the other parts?
What is an action RNs can take to be open to receiving mentoring as part of their professional practice?
I may miss the boat in answering this one, but from my perspective, I need to, number one, understand the value of what I'm going to get from a mentoring relationship. And then from there, be willing to give it the chance or the opportunity to take place, versus, always putting up the obstacles or barriers as to why we can't. We need to focus on why we could, and then understand what the benefits are. When you take a look at the research that's been done, the benefits of mentoring in the workplace, um, there's so many, the percentages are so high that I can't honestly figure out why most organizations don't have a workplace mentoring program in place today. But it also, as I said earlier, it also needs to be that blended version of informal and formal. That's what's going to work the best.
Okay.
Now, I think I recall the other one, the resources and that. I mean, there's lots of stuff on the internet that you can go and look for. And I don't like to plug, but I'm going to plug. My business partner and I have created he created a YouTube channel, and we actually record on a weekly basis what we call community conversations, and it's about all things mentoring. So if you're interested, Yvonne, what I can do is send you the link to the YouTube channel, and we do these recordings on a weekly basis. So I'm more than willing to provide you the link to his YouTube channel, and it'll give people a sort of a sense. And if that doesn't do it for you, then come back to me again, because we actually were creating a library of information that can be accessed. And we'll talk about that offline, but we can certainly take a look at that. In addition, just like I do lots of Google searches, and I find all kinds of different stuff that's out there.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. We'll make sure we get that link as part of this webinar series. That would be very beneficial, I think. What can organizations do to develop a mentoring culture? I know you talked about having an organization make it part of their general culture. Are there some specific things, maybe in terms of some sort of structure in their organization that will help build that culture of mentorship?
So there's two things to think about. The first is the organization ready today for mentoring? And part of that is typically what I've seen done, and I've done some of this myself for organizations, is we've done a culture assessment. So we've looked at, and it's a culture assessment not in the context of culture as we know it, but it's to determine whether the organization is actually mentor ready or not. And then from there, we can sort of decide what is it that we need to do. So I've had some where one of the barriers to being able to implement mentoring successfully was that people didn't know how to have, what's the word I'm looking for? Communications, crucial conversations. They didn't know how to have a crucial conversation. And so we had to provide them with some tools to be able to do that. And then we were able to start to move forward with implementing mentoring. Some things to think about. So a culture of mentoring. So think of it from, we need to have some structure. We need to have corporate support. So there has to be the corporate support. We're going to have to look at some sort of training at some stage. And then we need to have a communication strategy so that we can promote what it is that we're going to do, and sort of, I call it the marketing hype is, stay tuned. Next month is going to be an exciting time in our organization, and you just keep building and building on that. And I think the big thing is that failure isn't an option for us. So going into this, we want to go into it for the right reasons. So part of that is understanding, what is the business problems that I'm trying to solve by implementing a mentoring culture.
Okay. Is there a minimum or maximum amount of time that a member-mentee relationship should be? So is there, should it be, I know you've said you had one person you had to have sort of this relatively short period of time to do this mentorship. Is there a minimum or maximum?
No, not that's driven by what the mentor and the mentee want to have in place. So I have I'm working with a leadership team right now that I have a mentoring relationship with each one of them that's probably 5-6 years in duration. So a president and part of his leadership team. So it's probably been 5 to 6 years that we've been working together at various stages. There's some that have only been, they've kind of come in, dipped their toe in the mentoring swimming pool and said, okay, not for me, and stepped out. And so we probably had maybe 2 or 3 sessions. And then I have others. I'm working with 2 young men in Kingston, Jamaica, who have a restaurant there, and we've been together now probably about 3 years.
Okay. So yeah, it sounds like it can last a lifetime in some cases, hey?
Yeah, it definitely can.
Wow. All right. I don't see any more questions at this point. And it looks like the clock is starting to wind down. So I think if there's no more questions, we can prepare to wind down for today's webinar. And I'll just give a bit of brief information about the next webinar, which is scheduled for the same time, but on June 18th. And we'll just be building on what you've talked about today and then adding a little bit more information. In the meantime, if people do have questions, I think they're free to just send them in to us, and we'll make sure that we get the questions to you so that you can share your expertise in answering those questions. So if you're okay with that, I will get ready to wind down today's webinar. I look forward to part 2 of the series, same time. And I do thank you. This has been so interesting for me. I've been taking all kinds of notes. So I do appreciate what you have shared with us, as I'm sure all the attendees do. So thank you. All right. So I will end the meeting now if no one has anything to say. Thank you again, Doug.
Okay, thank you. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.